Hello and welcome to Community Forum. My name is Wayne Pomiansky and I'll be hosting today's program. Our guest is Senator Brian A. Joyce, who is currently serving his 8th term in the Massachusetts Senate, representing Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth, the Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth District, which includes the towns of Avon, Braintree, Canton, East Bridgewater, Easton, Milton, Randolph, Sharon, Stoughton, and West Bridgewater. Senator Joyce is a 1984 graduate of the Boston College School of Management and a magna cum laude graduate of Suffolk University Law School, where he was an editor of the Law Review. Senator Joyce is a practicing attorney who has taught both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. A member of a number of key committees here in the Commonwealth. First of all, he is the Senate Chair of the Committee on Bonding, Capital Expenditures, and State Assets, as well as the Senate Vice Chair of the Healthcare Financing Committee and the Financial Services Committee. He is, in addition, a member of the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, and also sits on the Economic Development and Emerging Technologies Committee, the Committee on Elder Affairs, and the Transportation Committee. So, again, Senator Joyce, welcome to Community Forum.
Happy to be here.
Good to have you. The legislative session, of course, ended just a few days ago, and I love that political question that all of the candidates running for office always ask, which is, are we better off now, and in this case, say, compared to 2 years ago in the Commonwealth?
Well, I think we are, actually. I think the last 2-year session, each legislative session now is 2 years or thereabouts, and I think we accomplished quite a bit. And I think you're going to talk about some of the bills just in the last couple of weeks. You mentioned healthcare financing.
Yes.
We just passed really landmark legislation to contain healthcare costs in Massachusetts. You know, back in 2006, we passed legislation which was landmark and has garnered a lot of attention nationally, where we provide health insurance to about 98 or 99% of our legal residents in Massachusetts. And even then, we knew the greater challenge was to contain the costs, or the rising healthcare costs that were really overwhelming families and overwhelming businesses and overwhelming government, and to the point that, you know, healthcare costs for government spending, for example, had gone from about 20 to soon to be 40% of all government dollars. So it overwhelmed our ability to do anything else. We see that about 60% of all the bankruptcies in this country were caused by healthcare costs borne by those families, and we see that it's really an incredible burden for small businesses. We just passed legislation that we think will save some $200 billion in our Massachusetts economy over the next 20 years. Really an extraordinary number. But to quantify, are we better off now than we were 2 years ago? What I look to more than anything else is our economy and our jobs numbers. And from January 2011 to today, as we sit here in August of 2012, our unemployment rate has dropped 1.8%, almost 2%. So we're far below the national average. We're still not where we want to be, but there's a clear quantification that things are, albeit slowly, getting better. We're emerging from what was probably the greatest economic challenge this generation will face.
And we're doing that without fracking, I should mention, because I know some of the states out in the Midwest that are very involved with this new technology in terms of generating larger quantities of coal or oil and gas, I should say, are using this new technology of fracking. Yet our economy seems to be building on financial services, healthcare, education here in Massachusetts.
It's a good point. I mean, I traveled recently, not too long ago, to China with the governor of Montana, with the Ways and Means chair of Wyoming, and the Senate president of Alaska, all states that have extraordinary natural resources, and as a result don't face some of the fiscal challenges, I suppose, that other states may have. Here, our great resource is our people. We are a knowledge-based economy. We don't have these huge coal reserves or oil reserves or some of the other natural resources you see in states such as Wyoming and Montana or Alaska. But what we do have are extraordinary centers of medical science, life sciences, biotech, our great universities, and that's really what drives our economy. So one of the challenges facing us in this healthcare cost containment bill was to address rising healthcare costs that, as I mentioned, are so difficult for families that are watching this program, businesses, government, but to do so without harming this incredibly important part of our economy. I mean, if you go over to the area where Children's Hospital and Beth Israel and Mass General, any workday, it's just teeming with people in good-paying jobs doing some wonderful things. I mean, Children's Hospital was just rated the #1 such facility in the country. And Beth Israel and Mass General, they're doing wonderful work. We need to contain the costs and do so without harming our economic well-being and our recovery. So it was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I think also, U.S. News and World Report does, I think, an annual survey of the best hospitals, and I believe this year Mass General surpassed Johns Hopkins as the one that was rated #1 in the U.S. News and World Report survey. I'm not sure how credible they are in terms of evaluating
Well, I mean, it might be #1, it might be #2 or 3 or 4, but clearly we have centers of medical excellence largely driven by our great universities and our brain power. So that's our resource, and that's really what helps drive our economy. So the Massachusetts economy is doing well. Again, small solace for anyone who's watching who's underemployed or unemployed, but we continue to work very hard to further improve our economy. We just passed a jobs bill about 2 weeks ago that I was quite involved in crafting the Senate provisions. And one area that I've focused a lot of attention on now is energy efficiency. There's been a lot of money in recent years, Wayne, spent on trying to create alternative and new forms of energy. And actually, we probably see more bang for our buck investing in energy efficiency in our existing, particularly commercial and industrial buildings. And so one of the keys is trying to unlock the financing so that businesses can retrofit their facilities with more energy efficient lighting and insulation and the like. Has enormous potential. I have a plan put together to create about $1 billion in bonding from mass development. Would cost the taxpayers nothing, but it would be AAA rated bonds that would generate about 3.25% for profit entities, about 2.75% charge for governmental entities. It provides the financing for those property owners to retrofit their building and to realize significant energy savings. What that does, it has a real multiplier effect. We estimate would create over 10,000 jobs. And those jobs are ones where you have small businessmen, folks in the building trades that are particularly hard hit in the recession, give them work. They in turn go to the local suppliers to buy their supplies.
Sure.
That helps those folks with their keeping jobs. And then the property owners are no longer spending this money on electricity or gas or oil. That frees up money for them to create still more jobs. So it has a real multiplier effect. So we're focusing a lot of efforts. That's happens to be a particular project of mine. I think it also has great societal benefit.
Absolutely.
Reducing
greenhouse gases.
Exactly. Yep. But that continues to be the focus of our efforts. We just passed a transportation bond bill. The governor will be signing it today. I have a number of items in that bond bill that help not only statewide, but help projects in my district. I was on that conference committee and intimately involved with crafting that legislation. It provides funding statewide for research grants for our universities to allow them to go after this federal grant money, and it creates more opportunities in Massachusetts. But locally, we refund this Mass Works, what we used to call Public Works Economic Development Grants. We see them throughout my district in downtown Stoughton or in Easton or in Randolph or Sharon or Canton or Milton or Braintree. Any one of these towns, you see where these Mass Works grants, the public investment in infrastructure leverages or encourages private investment to revitalize our downtowns. In the town of Randolph right now, we have about $3 million in state grants that's helping to revitalize that whole downtown, the whole corridor of North Main Street. Also in the transportation bond bill, working with Rep. Galvin, Rep. Kafka, we here in Stoughton have an opportunity for the town of Stoughton to take over the abandoned train station that's in the center of town. It was something that was designed by Charles Brigham, who designed the second half of the State House over 100 years ago. And this could be an economic cog for the revitalization of downtown Stoughton. And we provide some funding for the town's costs. And so we have a number of statewide initiatives to further improve our economy, but I've been quite vigilant in ensuring that we have a number of projects specific to my district. In Milton, for example, I was with the Transportation Secretary this morning, where we have a deck over the expressway. The expressway went down in the 50s and divided the town of Milton, cut off East Milton Square in the business district, and created essentially a canyon that we, back in the 80s, then Congressman Donnelly was able to secure funding, about $10 million, to put a lid on that deck. But it's kind of a wasteland. There's no practical benefit to the merchants who are crying out for parking in this town that's only about 3% commercial tax base, and we want to keep pressure off the local property, residential property tax base. So we stepped in this transportation bond bill, an initiative that I authored to allow for changes on that deck, provide up to $1 million in state funding so as to provide an economic revitalization of East Milton Square. So I have issues like that throughout the district, sprinkled in with these statewide initiatives that I think will allow me to come back 2 years from now and say that we're still even better than we were, back in 2012.
Right, very good. Let's, I know you're obviously a key member as vice chair of the Healthcare Financing Committee. Let's talk a little more about healthcare, because I have to admit, I personally am a little bit skeptical about how either in the Commonwealth or even nationally, given the advancement of technology, that we're ever really going to be able to rein in healthcare spending. I mean, I have a couple of, a very good friend who has two daughters who are in medical school right now, one at UMass Medical Center, one in New York City, and just learning as a layperson about some of the extraordinary technologies that are today being used in medicine, I'm hard pressed to understand how do we get the costs down? And I'm just wondering, are there 2 or 3 or 4 key components of the healthcare legislation that you look at and say, this really is going to save some money? Because I wonder how we're going to really do that.
Well, you make several excellent points. First and foremost, first I'll say your friends have 2 very bright daughters to be getting into medical school today. The advances in medicine are truly breathtaking, just truly extraordinary, and a lot of them are happening right here in Massachusetts. My own dad will be 93 in October. I joke with him, if Morris the cat had 9 lives, he has 100 lives.
Right.
Certainly, but for the extraordinary advances in medicine, we wouldn't have him with us today, and that's just incredible. We're blessed. But that comes at a cost. So we recognize that these great advances that we've made in medicine come at a cost, no question. Nevertheless, we do have an opportunity, not necessarily, Wayne, to reduce the overall cost of healthcare, but to reduce the rate of growth. in that cost. As I mentioned, just a few years ago, healthcare costs were about 20% of government spending. Very soon, they'll reach, unless we do something else, 40% of government spending. And the rate of acceleration is not really linear, it's geometric. And it's getting to the point that we won't have the ability to do anything else. In other words, it'll impede our ability to provide for public safety, for public infrastructure investments, for public education, for other things that we expect from government. The same thing's happening to families. I mentioned in excess of 60% of the bankruptcies in this country are driven by rising healthcare costs. Small businesses are strangled with healthcare costs. And actually, I put a provision, and I worked with others to put a provision in for small businesses. I'm keenly attuned to the needs of small businesses that really drive our economy, and they were being penalized for not providing insurance to some of their employees that got their insurance through their spouses or had it from retiring from previous positions. We took care of that and got rid of that penalty. So we've done some, address some of the particular concerns of the healthcare bill that was back in '06. But in terms of the cost containment bill that we've just passed, the enemy of good is better. We could always do better, but this is a pretty darn good bill. You asked, there's a couple of broad strokes that would help explain bringing down the costs. It is a particularly complicated bill, but in broad strokes. One, preventative medicine. About 65% of all healthcare costs are largely driven by preventable chronic illnesses. So we spend a fair amount in this legislation focusing on preventative medicine. Just like your mother used to tell you,
right?
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we have about a $60 million fund, in fact, to kickstart this initiative for more preventative medicine. And we provide incentives for medical providers to work towards outcomes rather than just fee for service. So if there's a financial incentive for a medical provider to send you for another test, another x-ray, another MRI, another ultrasound, whatever it is, that's often what they'll do. But if there's an incentive to promote positive outcomes, good, robust health, maybe because you've had better nutrition, better diet and better exercise, better education. So we have financial incentives to avoid some of the future costs. We also see there are some great innovations already occurring without governmental intervention or interference. And we have some sections of the bill that promote still more innovation among different groups of medical providers. We also take advantage of the technology that you mentioned to further the initiative for electronic record sharing and cut down on some of the bureaucratic costs of paper and repeating the same information. So there's a number of approaches. There's some financial penalties for healthcare providers that their costs rise more than the cost of living. So it's a particularly complicated bill, but we think it's a pretty good bill, and it's largely been very, very well received so far.
I was going to ask you about that because, again, looking at the folks that I know that are currently involved in medical education and recognizing that, they work many, many years to get an MD degree. Maybe they go into family medicine, maybe they become specialists. A lot of stress associated with becoming a doctor. I guess if I were a physician, I'd be a little bit concerned if we were going to radically change the mode of compensation from something that's quite measurable, a fee for a service, versus something that seems to me to be a little bit more esoteric. How do we really measure outcomes when we, even as a fine physician, can't really absolutely control what that outcome will be? Are the doctors on board? Do they support this direction?
By and large, yes. And there were so many stakeholders involved here. And let's be clear, we're not only interested in reducing the rate of increased costs in healthcare, we're also keenly interested in improving outcomes. Interestingly, the United States spends about the highest percentage of GDP on healthcare of any nation in the world, but we don't have the greatest outcomes. So we're looking to improve the delivery of quality medical services, at the same time reduce the rate of increase in cost. There were so many stakeholders, it was a bit like herding cats.
Right.
There's not just the doctors, but the nurses and all of the other medical professionals. And there's a whole panoply of medical professionals that help provide the good health care that we have in Massachusetts, as well as the hospitals, as well as the insurance companies, and most importantly, the patients. So there were an awful lot of entities that were seated at the table. I give a lot of credit. I think Deval Patrick has done an excellent job. I think that on the Senate side, Senator Richard Moore, who I have the pleasure of serving with, he's the chair of the committee that you mentioned, I'm vice chair, did an outstanding job. There were a number of folks that I think really dozens and dozens that were involved in crafting this bill, and I think that it's going to be a smashing success. The enemy of good is better. We can always strive for the perfect bill, but this is, by and large, addresses the oft competing needs. I think one of the reasons we were able to finally get everyone together is that everyone realized the current system was ultimately unsustainable.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case, and I think we are finally coming to the realization that we can't keep kicking the can down the road, so to speak, and that we really do have to intervene and make some pretty significant changes. So where does the bill last now? Has it been signed by the governor?
Signed just a couple of days ago, yes.
It was signed, so it is in fact being enacted.
It is law.
Okay, so $20 billion saving over
200
billion over 20 years. That is pretty substantial. Let's hope it plays out that way. Let's talk a little bit more about the jobs bill. Again, same kind of question. Our unemployment rate here in Massachusetts is lower than many states. We have a highly educated workforce, especially in the greater Boston area. There are still pockets of higher unemployment in other parts of the state. Key components of the job bill, again, maybe the 2 or 3 elements.
Well, we have some infrastructure improvement ability for the private sector to make improvements and create essentially local improvement districts where a bit of a public-private partnership, I guess it would be, the private investment in local infrastructure that could be applied toward their property tax bill over a number of years. There's a number of economic development initiatives, the extension of the existing permits so that projects that were previously permitted but because of a difficult economy hadn't been built, we give them a little bit more time to kickstart some of those projects. There was something another provision that I put in is interesting, something called a B Corp. We have different forms of governance of business entities. So you could have a partnership, or you could have a corporation, or you could have a sole proprietorship. And within corporations, we have the traditional C Corp, just the traditional corporation. Sometimes you hear people talking about an S Corp or a professional corporation, a PC. Well, I put a provision in that prevailed to create something called a B Corp or a benefit corporation. We would join, I think, about 11 other states that would. It's interesting because when you have a traditional corporation and you are the fiduciary, you are the say the chief executive of XYZ Corporation, your fiduciary obligation to the shareholders typically is to maximize wealth. Well, the B Corp or benefit corporation would allow that company to take into consideration not only shareholder wealth, not only maximizing profit, but also the benefit to the community, typically the benefit to the environment, so that it allows a company to do good while
Doing well.
while doing well.
Okay.
And it allows investors, say a socially conscious investor may want to invest their capital in that corporation. So you have buildings now that are LEED certified, or you have coffee beans that are organically grown. It has that stamp of approval. This B Corp would have that stamp of approval, and they have to meet certain criteria that an investor or an employee or a consumer would know that this is a socially conscious entity. And it's funny, ideas come to me from a lot of different
constituents, hopefully.
a lot of different. This was my baby is 14 years old. He wouldn't want me to call him a baby. My youngest is 14, and this came from a mom of a boy on his baseball team.
Really?
So, she said, "Why doesn't Massachusetts have B Corps?" I didn't know what a B Corp was, and I learned it, and now we do.
Wow.
So,
excellent.
but there were a number of provisions in that jobs bill that we think will result in, again, further stimulating the economy.
Okay, interesting. Another area let's talk about is, again, it's a very important component of the economy, and that's housing. I've read recently that, we're seeing in some communities bidding wars for single-family homes that are on the market. I think that's the exception rather than the rule. Rentals are in short supply here in Massachusetts. I was listening to some economists this morning driving down to Stoughton who were talking about the housing market seems to have leveled off and is showing some signs of improvement, but there is still an overhang of foreclosures. And as I understand it, in this session, there was a foreclosure prevention bill. What's that about? How does that benefit?
Well, you're correct on both points. First, we did pass a foreclosure prevention bill that mandates essentially a cooling off period where a bank must look at whether it makes financial sense for the bank to, instead of foreclose, allow that homeowner to refinance, perhaps at a lower rate, extend the payment period. These empty homes, blight neighborhoods don't do anyone any good. And in many instances, it's in the bank's own interest, but certainly we want to provide a lifeline to some of these folks that are facing foreclosure. So we do implement some, we think, balanced measures to hopefully avoid some foreclosures, which still are a problem. I mean, you're correct that the housing market seems to have turned a corner. In fact, we have nationwide, I think, the lowest supply of single-family homes that we've had in 49 years. It's about a 6-month supply out there. So we're starting to see an uptick in building, and things have changed. You'll notice, Wayne, that we see more and more apartment buildings being built.
Yes.
I think for a number of reasons. I think societally we're pushing more towards so-called smart growth, so that you take up a smaller footprint, you are perhaps proximate to public transportation, mixed use, other shops, and professional businesses and the like. And I think a lot of people are moving out. I think as we age, a lot of folks are moving out of the suburban McMansions and going back towards urban centers. So we see an uptick in construction now, which is terrific for our economy. And it seems that, at least in my district, I see more of the multifamily housing, the apartment developments going up. And typically now, they are high-end. Typically, they're luxury rentals that appeal to folks making, families making, $50,000 to $100,000, and young professionals. There's less of a rush now because of recent economic events to home ownership, but We do see the housing market improving, thankfully. We still need to provide a lifeline to these folks facing foreclosure, and we think we've done it.
Is there any provision in the foreclosure prevention bill? You mentioned refinancing, encouraging the banks to maybe be a little more liberal in terms of making refinancing available. I know in some states there has been also some interest in having the banks permit folks to continue to rent their property if they can no longer afford the mortgage, stay in the property for some period of time as the housing market recovers, and simply let them rent the property at a lower monthly fee than, say, their mortgage was. Is that part of the bill at all, or is that really something?
Well, we had in the bill, there was a 150-day time frame wherein the bank must look at whether it made sense. We weren't trying to penalize the banks necessarily, but they had to make a good faith effort to see if it made sense to modify the loan. Presumably that loan modification was at a lower rent, a lower rate, which would be akin to charging, I guess, a rent, but would keep them in the home ownership mode. There was separate federal legislation, I think it was called, it had an acronym, it escapes me right now, Help America something or other, but there was separate federal legislation. There was nothing that I'm aware of in the state legislation that would mandate renting, but it did mandate a thorough financial analysis to see if it made sense to modify the loan.
In a general sense, Senator Joyce, do you, because I think the banks, get a knock of being, intransigent on, they got this big bailout, yet they're, not willing to be a little more flexible. Is it your sense, as a member of the Financial Services Committee, do you sense that the banks are showing more willingness to try to?
Well, we have a real dichotomy in the country. It seems we have the national banks and the federally chartered banks, over which the State Financial Services Committee that I sit on has very little regulatory authority, frankly. And then we have the local state chartered banks that often are far more lenient and far more willing to at least, recognize that there's a human component to this. It's not just all numbers. But by and large, I think much of the legislation that's been passed at both the state and the federal level has been necessary to ensure that the banks, and again, we use that term like it's one monolithic entity, and it's not, but that they act fairly with the consumers. I mentioned earlier that whole B Corp and allowing companies to be good corporate citizens, basically. And we used to see that, I think, more in our banks and our corporations and our companies. And now, it's easier for our utility is owned by an entity in Great Britain, or the bank that I bank with may be it's a European owned, it may be a Spanish, And the changes that are made and the fees or the decisions, they're computer driven or numbers driven, and too often that human component is left astride and so is left out. And so I think the legislation has been necessary in the world in which we're living and working now.
Well, certainly, it sounds like there have been some pretty significant strides made in this legislative session, and hopefully a number of our viewers potentially are benefiting from some of these programs. Similar question on the crime bill. I know Melissa's law was recently passed. I think you were a supporter. A little bit of resistance from the governor in terms of judicial discretion. But ultimately the governor did sign the bill. Other significant elements of the crime bill, that maybe two or three of them that you would highlight for this session?
Well, I think in terms of the crime bill, whenever there's something tragic or terrible that happens to us, personally to our society, that we want to do something. We want to do something about it. And there was a couple of triggering events here. One was the incredibly sad and tragic death of a young woman. You mentioned Melissa Gossel. Her dad, Les, turned this tragedy really into a mission to change the law, and he's one of the driving forces behind this bill. I think Melissa's mom used to teach in the Randolph schools, and Les works.
And I think she was right on 24, wasn't she, when her car broke down?
Yeah, it was down near the bridge on Cape Cod, the Bourne of the Sagamore, I think the Bourne. But her dad works in Milton as an accountant, and we had been pushing this bill for a number of years. There was also a police officer in, I think it was Woburn. Who was killed both times by a felon who had been convicted of multiple crimes. And so the idea behind this bill, while I appreciate what the governor says in terms of judges needing discretion in some instances, this bill to me is quite sound. And that is, if a person's been convicted twice of very serious crimes, now we're not talking about check kiting or
violent crimes.
We're talking about murder or rape, or murder shouldn't get out in any event, but we're talking very, very serious crimes. If there's a third conviction, there's no chance of parole or probation, and that's just, to me, common sense. Common sense, and so I hope that gives those families some comfort. The reality is we do have an extraordinary number of laws on the books, and we have some small segment of society that's not law-abiding. But when we can provide another tool, another law that can help prevent even just one more, father's daughter or children's father, like that police officer, from being killed, I support it.
That is legislation I think that everybody would support. Let's shift our focus a little bit to state aid for communities, towns, and cities. I think a lot of folks look at their state tax bill and say, gee, quite a bit of money goes to Beacon Hill. It'd be nice if some of it flowed back to the communities that you represent. Things are tight, obviously. What about state funding for communities?
Well, things are always tight. There's always virtually unlimited wants and needs, and certainly limited resources with which to pay for it. And so don't forget, we're just now in 2012, still not really back to where we were in 2008. So we're making do with less money, with more costs. We have certainly healthcare and other costs have continued to rise. We've done a pretty good job, I think, in balancing things. Actually, the Standard & Poor's bond rating agency raised our bond rating, which is extraordinary in this difficult time. Despite all that, we were actually able to increase funding going back to cities and towns in terms of state aid. So every single community covered by this television program is seeing an uptick in local aid. So more money for the schools and for public safety and the like. And the biggest share of state tax dollars goes back to cities and towns, primarily for the schools, some unrestricted. Every town, I think saw at least a $40 increase in per pupil state aid. And we also there was a provision that I sponsored along with Senator Clark from north of Boston and some others, to address what we saw was a further inequity in the distribution of tax dollars that provided still more benefit to a number of the towns I represent. So increase particularly the funding for the schools. In addition, a measure that I'd co-sponsored that prevailed was an increase in funding for our councils on aging. And we do have an aging population, and the COAs in each of the towns do an amazing job. And we increased funding, I think, by about 10% for veterans. You know, it's funny, Massachusetts, it's a badge of honor. You don't think of Massachusetts as, I guess, so gung-ho for the military as perhaps South Carolina or Virginia or, you know, a traditionally more militarily based state.
Yep.
But in Massachusetts, I think we provide, I know we do, we provide the best benefits for our returning servicemen and servicewomen of any state in the Union.
It certainly seems that way. Yeah.
So we did, we're able to have some targeted increases this year in particular areas that I think collectively our values are such that we want to invest in our schools, we want to invest in our seniors, we want to adequately provide for our returning veterans, and I think we did in this budget.
Anything there in terms of college funding, UMass now, the community colleges?
You know, I honestly, I don't think we've done enough there. I think we need to do more, and we're all shaped by our personal experiences.
Yeah.
I've had two that just went through college, and I have one there now and two more to go. And I'll tell you, for those of us in the middle class, these college bills are just overwhelming, and you don't want to burden your child with getting out of school with $100,000 or $150,000 worth of student loans. So what a lot of us do is we just put another mortgage on the house or something. So we did provide some increased funding. Frankly, in my opinion, not enough. And I think that's an area that we need to have further improvement.
Yeah, I read somewhere recently that student loan debt is actually higher than the aggregate of all credit card debt.
That is true.
And you know, students are, you know, facing, number one, a difficult economy to start with, coming out of college with either bachelor's degrees or associate degrees, and then not unheard of to have debt running into six figures. So
Mary and I tried very hard not to burden our children with these student loans, and we absorbed most of them ourselves, and yet you know, that means retirement's probably never an option for us.
You could forget about
now,
that.
Number two son is starting law school in another couple of weeks, and we had to say, you know, Mike, you're on your own here.
Right.
Good luck on that.
Well, you know, to your earlier point about preventive medical care and extending, you know, life expectancy, you know, maybe that has something to do with people living into their 90s just to pay off
their bills.
Their college bills. I was trying to remember what it cost, you know, for me to go to college a number of years ago, and I don't know, I think it was a couple of $1,000s a year, something like that, and you know, now that's one course.
So I mentioned my dad. He went to Boston College, and actually we've been able to track the tuition just at BC. He went to BC and got out in 1942, and it was $200 a semester.
No kidding.
And of his 8 children, 7 of us went to BC.
Really?
And so for my oldest brother, I think it was about $1,200.
Yeah.
For me, it was $4,000 my first year and over $7,000 my last year. So it went from $200, and again, this is geometric.
Yeah, it is, really.
And then to one of my sons graduated from BC and a daughter there now. It's now really all in. It's over 50,000.
Yeah.
It's like 55,000, and it's you know, it's unsustainable at some point.
Right.
And I might have been the last kid to work his way through that school. It's impossible for kids to do that now.
It is. I mean, I had the same experience. I was working in broadcasting when I was in college, and was able to pretty much cover all my expenses. Impossible to do that now. Just can't do it. Even in a state school, my son and my grandson is an out-of-state student at Rutgers. And that, you know, Rutgers is a state college of New Jersey, and I think that's about $38,000 a year for an out-of-state student.
Yeah, we love those out-of-state students to come into
right.
our state university system and pay a full boat. But I'll tell you, very few want to. We see that the demand for the state schools, the state universities, has gone up tremendously because perhaps it is a better value. You know, it's far more competitive to get into those universities than it once was, because there's, you know, the value proposition. What are we paying? What are we going to get out of it at the end? If you really were value conscious, what you'd consider is going to our community colleges
Right.
for 2 years. The
Yep.
community colleges are an exceptional value.
Absolutely.
Go for 2 years, then transfer into the state university system. The downside is, you miss some of that college experience.
Right, right. And that's, I think that is an important component, as long as you don't spend all of your time
And
partying and
my
not
children,
studying.
my children having their parents pay the bill also thought it was an important component.
Exactly, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about your district. You represent Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth District. We've had redistricting here in Massachusetts as a result of the loss of one of our congressional seats. Has it affected the makeup of your district?
No, it hasn't. 10 years ago, the district changed quite a bit. It changes after every federal census to ensure equal representation. So it's mandated, it's required by a constitution that we reapportion the districts to ensure equal representation for all voters at all levels. This is, congressional and state senate, governor's council, state representative. But my district actually didn't change this time. 10 years ago, I've been in 15 years, 10 years ago, it changed quite a bit. And Boston lost a seat, and I moved further to the burbs as the population had shifted. We didn't see a tremendous shift this time. The congressional district changed quite a bit, and I actually voted against that redistricting. A portion of Milton and all of Randolph were taken out of one congressional district and put into another, and I thought that was most unfortunate. Really, in order to get more minority population into a district, Randolph is now, and part of Milton is now in a congressional district with, Chelsea and, Everett and Somerville, and query whether one portion of Milton, which was necessary to get to Randolph, I guess, has more in common, or Randolph has more in common with its adjoining communities,
Absolutely.
or with Chelsea, or with Somerville, or it really made very, very little sense to me, and I think we kind of sacrificed common sense and bowed at the altar of political correctness. It was largely so that this district could go from, I think, 52% non-white or some such thing to 54%, and it was I think a very poorly thought decision.
Was that to meet court requirements, or?
I think it was largely activist driven, and what I saw was the real irony was in order to have more of a non-white population in one district, we're actually segregating communities. So part of Milton is now represented by a different congressman than the rest of Milton. Where's the real community of interest? So I thought that was a mistake. But my district was unchanged.
Okay. I know you're running for re-election.
Excuse me.
I always like to ask you this question whenever we get together for a conversation. You're running for re-election November. Any consideration to higher political office? I'm thinking now maybe a run for governor, Congress, something like that.
Right now, I think I swallowed something, so I'm hoping to just make it through this interview.
Right.
No, I'm perfectly happy where I am right now, and I have a leadership position in the Senate. I also have family responsibilities that require me to practice law as well in order to help with these tuition bills and other family expenses. So, no, I'm very comfortable where I am. I'm very happy with my position. I'm happy to say that I will be signing up for another 2-year tour of duty because I do not have an opponent in November. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to represent the people that I do. Every day I go to work, I know that I'm blessed to serve in the Massachusetts Senate, where John Adams and John Quincy Adams and Calvin Coolidge and other extraordinary men and women served in the past and serve today. I think we've done some very good things this year. Not just, we've talked about the healthcare financing, we've talked about transportation bond bill, we talked about the jobs bill, we talked about the crimes bill,
quite a bit.
talked about education funding. Next year we do have a significant further challenge, I think, in trying to address the unmet transportation needs in the state and the infrastructure improvement that is necessary to keep our economy growing, and I think I'll be integral to that discussion. I really enjoy, I thoroughly enjoy this job, and I still have a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm for it. I don't know if, you never say never.
Sure.
I'm not in a position right now, family-wise and professionally, to be looking at something else, but who knows what the future holds.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think there's no doubt that you will be re-elected to another Senate term. I think that's something we can predict. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we allow enough time to go through the announcements that we typically try to focus on during each of our programs. And then I did want to ask you about, I know one of the areas that, again, you've been quite outspoken about, and that's the use of aversives treatments. But let's get our announcements up, and then we'll come back to that topic in some of the time that we have remaining. First of all, of course, Senator Brian Joyce is our guest today. His contact information is room 109D at the State House in Boston, Mass. 02133. Phone number for Senator Joyce is 617-722-1643. You can email the senator at brian.a.joyce@masssenate.gov. Now, this is something new. We have a question of the day. Let's see if any of our viewers can answer this very, very complicated, difficult question, and that is, how many M's are there in Maxie's? And the answer is Maxie's, 3 M's. And as always, we would like to thank the folks at Maxie's Delicatessen for great luncheon food today. We taped a little bit later on this particular Thursday and really had some delicious deli. So the thanks to folks at Maxie's Delicatessen, located at 117 Sharon Street in Stoughton. You can reach them at 781-341-1662. The American Cancer Society is looking for volunteers to drive cancer patients to and from treatments. Contact number there is 1-800-ACS-6662. On the web, it's www.cancer.org. The Ilsa Marks Food Pantry and St. Anthony's Free Market, First United Methodist Church, also seeking volunteers to help support their programs. The contact, as always, is Ann Havlin. You can reach her at 781-341-0611 or 781-341-0549. Meals on Wheels, another terrific organization supporting our communities, seeking assistance with delivery of meals. The contact is Jessica, and you can reach her at 781-344-8882, extension 2. Community Forum showtimes in Stoughton. We are on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at 6 p.m., Monday at 8 p.m., Tuesday at 5 p.m. You can reach us on Comcast Channel 9 or Verizon Channel 28. If you have comments or suggestions, feel free to email us at communityforum1, the number 1, at yahoo.com. Our program also runs in the town of Easton. There, the show times are Monday at 9 p.m., Tuesday at 8 a.m., Friday at 4 p.m., Saturday 3 in the afternoon, Comcast Channel 9, Verizon Channel 22, and again, feel free to write us on the web at communityforum1 at yahoo.com. We have about 5 minutes left. I mentioned an area that you've been very involved with, and that's the use of aversives or painful shock treatment at the Judge Rotenberg Center. What's been happening, Senator Joyce, on that issue?
So for folks that might not know about it, this Judge Rotenberg Center used to be called the Behavioral Research Institute. That's right here in Canton, and they have group homes in a number of these communities that this show airs. They treat our disabled children, autistic children largely, and also others with some sort of behavioral difficulties. And this is completely different now. We're not talking about any sort of shock therapy that mental health professionals use, electroshock. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a painful electric device strapped to a person that could result in their flesh being burned. Just a painful device to control behavior. I mean, truly barbaric.
And this is still happening.
Still, incredibly, Wayne, it happens in 2012 in Massachusetts, one of the most progressive states and one of the most progressive nations in the world. And it is just stunning to the point that I've recently appeared on CNN with Anderson Cooper a couple of times. I got interviewed last week. I was a little bit nervous about it with Al Jazeera, which is the largest network for the Muslim world. Just incredible that this happens in our little district, our little corner of the world, and to my knowledge, nowhere else. And the United Nations termed it torture, said that we are allowing torture to go on here in Massachusetts to disabled children. And I do believe that we in government have a moral obligation to defend the defenseless. And so it has been a cause of mine to try to protect these children. And you know, we're up against an entity that's taking in over $50 million, most of it tax dollars, incredibly, and spending millions and millions and millions and millions, I mean, countless tens of millions of dollars on lawyers and lobbyists and public relations to keep this operation afloat. But there's a lot of good people that have joined the effort to stop the, what I think is brutalization of innocent children. And we've had a fair amount of success. We're now joined by the governor, to his credit, to his great credit. And last October, new regulations went into effect that have, by and large, have stopped any new students entering the school from being subjected to this barbaric treatment, and also severely regulating what can be done to the existing children, and eventually it'll be phased out in the very near future. So we see that this, this governor has stood shoulder to shoulder with me in trying to protect these innocent children, and for that I'll always be grateful. It's become a bit of a campaign issue because a previous governor who did not take steps to protect these children is now running for president, and Romney, and so that's garnering a little bit of attention as well. But my interest here is not political, it's really just to protect these kids, and I think we've had some positive steps.
Very good. Well, we will continue to follow that issue. We are just about out of time. I do want to thank Senator Brian Joyce for joining us on Community Forum. Never reluctant to come in and talk about all of the issues.
But one of the things in the future, I love that Maxie's Deli, but I shouldn't have the sandwich right before I come in here. I've decided
it was pretty tasty, though.
It was pretty tasty.
Thank you, Senator Joyce, and we'll see you next time.